Princess Valera stood at her window, watching the twin moons rise over the crystal spires of the imperial capital. At just 4 feet tall, she had to use a hovering platform to reach the window ledge, something that made her heart sink every time she used it. Around her, the palace halls were built for her people's normal height of 12 feet, making her feel like a child's doll in a giant's house. "Your Highness," a gentle voice called from behind her. "Prince Zithor of the Northern Territories has arrived for your meeting." Valera closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Number 200, she whispered to herself before turning to face her assistant, Lyra. "I suppose we shouldn't keep him waiting." As she floated down from her window perch, Valera caught her reflection in the polished crystal walls. Her silver skin sparkled with the traditional royal markings, and her large violet eyes shone with an intelligence that most failed to notice. Her long white hair was braided in the complex pattern of an unmarried princess, a style she had worn for far too long. The meeting hall, like everything else in the palace, was enormous. Prince Zithor waited there, his 12-foot frame draped in the finest shimmer silk from the nebula markets. Valera noticed how his eyes widened when she entered on her hover platform, despite trying to hide his surprise. "Princess Valera." He bowed, but she could see him struggling not to look down at her. "The tales of your unique stature weren't exaggerated." "No, they weren't," she replied calmly, though her heart raced. "Just as the tales of your diplomatic achievements aren't exaggerated. Shall we discuss the possibility of joining our houses?" The next hour was painfully familiar. Zithor was polite, even kind, but his discomfort grew with each passing minute. He kept glancing at the hover platform, especially when she had to adjust its height to reach for a cup of ceremonial tea. "Princess," he finally said, his voice careful, "you are clearly intelligent and well-educated, but I'm too small." Valera finished for him. "I wouldn't be able to produce proper hairs. I would embarrass you at diplomatic functions. I would make your house appear weak." Zithor's silver skin flushed a darker shade. "You must understand. The Northern Territories are proud." "Thank you for your time, Prince Zithor." Valera cut him off. Her voice steadied despite the pain in her chest. "Lyra will show you out." After he left, Valera floated to her private garden, the only place in the palace built to her scale. Here, among the miniature trees and small fountains, she could pretend she was normal. But the illusion shattered when she saw the massive buildings looming beyond her garden walls. 200 rejections, she said to the small flowers. 200 noble houses that would rather risk imperial disapproval than have a tiny princess. Her 30th cycle was approaching, the deadline for royal marriage according to laws older than the empire itself. After that, she would lose her right to the succession, and worse, bring shame to her family. Valera touched the data tablet at her waist, pulling up the Imperial Species Registry. She had studied it countless times, looking at all the approved races for royal marriage. All of them were similar to her people, tall, majestic, perfect. Then her finger paused on a recent addition, humans. Added just 5 years ago, they were considered primitive but showed potential. Most importantly, they were small, ranging from 5 to 6 feet tall. "Lyra," she called, her voice stronger than it had been all day, "get me everything we have on humans." And she paused, knowing her next words could change everything. "Don't tell my father." As the twin moons climbed higher in the sky, Valera began to read about Earth. For the first time in years, she felt something new growing in her heart. Hope. Dr. James Chen wiped sweat from his forehead as he looked up, way up, at the Imperial Atmospheric Processor. The massive machine towered above him like a metal mountain, its silver surface reflecting the light of the twin moons. Around him, giant alien technicians rushed about, each one nearly 3 times his height. "This way, Dr. Chen," his imperial guide, Turak, said from 12 feet above. "The emergency council is waiting." James nodded and quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing in the massive hallway. After 3 years working as Earth's top terraforming engineer, he thought he'd gotten used to feeling small. The imperial capital was proving him wrong. The council chamber was like everything else in the empire. Enormous. James sat in a chair designed for beings much larger than himself, feeling like a child at the adults' table. Holograms flickered to life around him, showing the processor's failing systems in bright red. The atmospheric readings are dropping faster than predicted. One of the council members boomed. If we don't stabilize the processor soon, half the colony will become uninhabitable. James studied the data floating before him. The numbers didn't add up. According to everything he knew about terraforming, the processor should be working perfectly. Unless, excuse me, a soft voice said from somewhere near his eye level. James turned and found himself looking directly into a pair of striking violet eyes. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The alien woman before him was small, by imperial standards tiny, but there was something captivating about her presence. Those carbon readings, she said, pointing to a section of his data. They're fluctuating in an unusual pattern. James blinked and looked back at the numbers. She was right. The pattern was subtle, something only someone who really understood atmospheric chemistry would notice. "You're seeing it too?" he asked, excitement creeping into his voice. The carbon isn't just building up, it's cycling wrong. Above them, the council members continued their loud debate, but James barely heard them. He and the small alien woman were deep in discussion, pointing out patterns and making quick calculations on their datapads. I'm James Chen. He finally remembered to introduce himself. "Valera," she replied with a slight smile. "Just Valera. No title," he noticed. "Dr. Chen." Turak's voice boomed from above. "If you have something to contribute, please share it with the full council." James stood on his chair to be better seen, though he still only reached the council members' shoulders. "There's a problem with the carbon recycling system," he explained. "It's not a malfunction in the processor itself. Something is interfering with the natural cycle." "Impossible," one of the council members scoffed. "Our systems are perfect." "Actually," Valera's clear voice rang out, "the human is correct. Look at these patterns." The council members fell silent as new data filled the air around them. James watched in admiration as Valera explained the complex chemical interactions, her knowledge of imperial systems complementing his terraforming experience perfectly. "This is unexpected," Turak finally said. "A human. And well, your insights are appreciated. Dr. Chen, you will work with Valera to investigate further." As the council members filed out, James turned to thank Valera for her support, but she was already hurrying away. Just before she disappeared through a door sized for someone her height, she glanced back at him with those striking violet eyes. James smiled to himself as he gathered his datapad. For the first time since arriving at the imperial capital, he felt like he'd found someone who saw the universe the way he did, not through size or species, but through the elegance of scientific truth. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger adventure. Valera paced in her small garden, her hover platform switched off for once. Her datapad showed the message she'd written to Dr. Chen 15 times without sending. Imperial protocol was clear. All communication had to go through proper channels. Direct contact between a princess and a foreign engineer was forbidden. But the carbon cycle problem wouldn't leave her mind. "Your Highness," Lyra called from the garden's entrance. "Your father expects you at the evening meal in 20 minutes. Valera looked at her datapad one last time. Then, instead of deleting the message, she pressed send. Across the capital, James Chen was elbow-deep in processor diagnostics when his pad chimed. He nearly dropped his tools when he saw the sender's name. The message was simple. "Meet me at Observation Platform 7 in 2 hours. Bring your atmospheric data." 2 hours later, James stepped onto the observation platform, a quiet spot overlooking the massive processor. He found Valera already there, without her hover platform. sitting on a bench that seemed made for someone her size. "I had this area modified years ago," she explained, noticing his surprise. "It's easier to think when you're not constantly reminded of what you're not." James sat down beside her, realizing this was the first time they'd been at eye level. "I know the feeling. Though on Earth, I'm actually slightly above average height." Valera's eyes widened. "Really? Then you're people." She stopped herself. "We should focus on the processor." For the next hour, they pored over data together. James found himself repeatedly impressed by her insights into Imperial technology, while Valera was fascinated by his creative human approaches to problems. "See," she pointed to a graph. "The carbon isn't just cycling wrong. It's being actively diverted. Someone modified the processor's programming." James leaned closer to see, catching a faint scent like silver flowers. But why would anyone? He stopped as he heard heavy footsteps approaching. "Princess Valera." Lyra's worried voice called out. "The Imperial Guard is looking for you. Your father noticed your absence from dinner." Valera jumped up, her face paling to a lighter silver. "I have to go." "But James, Dr. Chen, we need to meet again. There's more to this than just a mechanical problem." "Tomorrow," he said quickly. "Same time." She nodded, then hurried away with Lyra. James watched them go, noticing how Valera moved with a grace that had nothing to do with her hover platform. Back in her chambers, Valera faced her angry father's hologram. Emperor Cathax's image towered over her, his royal markings glowing with disapproval. "Meeting alone with a human," he thundered. "Have you lost all sense of propriety? Bad enough that you failed to secure a proper marriage. Now you risk our family's honor." "Father, the processor will be handled by proper Imperial engineers. You will cease this inappropriate behavior immediately." After the hologram faded, Valera sat in her window seat, watching the processor's lights in the distance. The problem nagged at her mind, along with the memory of how it felt to talk with someone who looked her in the eye, instead of down at her. She made her decision. "Lyra," she called softly, "I need you to help me with something. Something that might get us both in serious trouble." Lyra sighed but smiled. "Of course, Your Highness. When do we start?" Valera looked at her data pad, where a new message from James waited. "Found something strange in the old maintenance logs. Need your expertise." "Now," she said. "We start now." News travels fast in the Imperial capital, especially when it involves a princess and a human. In the great halls of the palace, Valera's older brother, Prince Kex, smiled as he watched the latest gossip spread through the nobles' data feeds. "Our little sister has finally made herself useful," he said to his advisors, even if she didn't mean to. Meanwhile, James was getting his own taste of political pressure. His morning started with an urgent call from Earth's ambassador. "Dr. Chen," Ambassador Williams said, her face serious on the video screen. "You need to stop meeting the princess. We can't risk a diplomatic incident." "With all respect," James replied, "we're trying to solve a serious problem with the processor. Lives could be at risk." "That's not your concern anymore." The Imperial engineers. A loud alarm cut through their conversation. Red warning lights flashed across James's data pad. Something was very wrong at the processor. Across the city, Valera was arguing with her sister, Princess Meetle, when the same alarm reached the palace. "You're making our whole family look foolish," Meetle was saying. "Running around with a human of all things." Valera's data pad lit up with emergency signals. Her eyes widened as she read the numbers. "No time for this," she said, activating her hover platform. "The processor is going into meltdown." She raced through the palace halls, ignoring her sister's shouts. The emergency meeting chamber was chaos when she arrived. Imperial engineers rushed around, shouting numbers and warnings. In the middle of it all, she spotted James, already working at a control panel. "The main cooling system is offline," he called out as she approached. "And the backup isn't responding. Someone locked us out of the controls." Valera said, her fingers flying over her datapad. This isn't an accident. It's sabotage. Above them, the council members argued about procedures and protocols. But Valera and James were already working together, their earlier practice paying off. If we can't access the main controls, James said, we need to think like humans. Find a way around. Valera's eyes lit up. Or think like someone small. There's a maintenance tunnel, built for repair droids. It leads right to the manual override. But it's too small for anyone to reach, an Imperial engineer protested. Valera and James looked at each other. They were the only ones in the capital who could fit. It's not safe, James said. If the cooling system fails while we're inside, then we better not fail, Valera replied. They raced to the processor complex, ignoring the shouts of protest behind them. The maintenance tunnel was hot and narrow, barely big enough for them to crawl through. Even the repair droids had stopped using it years ago. Wait, Lyra called after them. Your Highness, your brother Prince Kex is demanding you return to the palace immediately. Tell him I'm a little busy saving his life, Valera called back as she entered the tunnel with James. Inside, the heat was intense. Their datapads showed the temperature rising dangerously. They crawled as fast as they could, following the tunnel's twisting path. Valera, James said as they reached a junction. If we survive this, I think someone tried to kill two birds with one stone here. Birds? Stones. She panted, confused by the Earth saying. I mean, this sabotage, it's not just about the processor. Someone's using this to target you too. Valera paused for a moment, thinking of her brother's recent smiles, her sister's accusations. I think you're right. But first, let's survive. Then we can worry about who wants me gone. They pressed on, racing against time, while above them, the massive processor groaned with building pressure. 3 days after saving the processor, Valera sat in her garden watching a hologram of Earth. James stood beside her bench, pointing out the different continents and oceans. And that's where I grew up, he said, zooming in on a coastal city, San Francisco. It's famous for its fog and bridges. Valera leaned closer to the hologram. It's also small, she said. Your buildings, your vehicles, everything. But that's what makes it beautiful, James replied. We build to our size, not beyond it. Every culture does things differently. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Lyra rushing into the garden. Your Highness, the Imperial Court is gathering for an emergency session. They're discussing you. Valera's heart sank. After the processor incident, she'd become a hero to the maintenance workers and engineers. But to the noble houses, she'd committed an unforgivable sin. She'd worked side by side with a human. I should go, James said, understanding the situation. No, Valera touched his arm. Stay, watch the proceedings from here. I want you to understand what we're facing. The garden's main hologram screen came to life, showing the vast imperial court chamber. Hundreds of 12-foot-tall nobles filled the space, their silver skin and status markings gleaming. Prince Kex stood to speak first. My honored father, he addressed the emperor. Our beloved sister has gone too far. Working with a human, crawling through maintenance tunnels like a common drone. These actions shame our family. Valera watched James's face as her brother spoke. His expression stayed calm, but she saw his hands clench slightly. The princess's actions saved lives. A new voice rang out. Turak, the engineering chief, stood up, and the human engineer proved his worth. The court erupted in arguments. Valera switched off the hologram. Now you see what we're dealing with, she said quietly. James was silent for a moment. Then he pulled out his datapad. Let me show you something else about Earth, he said. He opened a history program, showing images of human civilization. Every major advance we made came from someone doing something differently. Flying when others said we couldn't. Going to space when they said it was impossible. surviving when bigger, stronger species said we were too small. Valera watched the images flow past. Your people face challenges like this. Still do, but we adapt. We find new ways. He paused. Speaking of which, I have an idea about how to handle your court. He showed her his datapad again, this time displaying Earth's entertainment channels. See how we tell our stories, how we share our ideas. Maybe we can help your people see things differently too. Valera's eyes widened as she understood. A public presentation. Not just about the processor, but about how different doesn't mean wrong. James finished. About how sometimes being small just means you see things others miss. Their planning was interrupted by another alert from Lyra. Your Highness, Ambassador Williams from Earth, is requesting an immediate meeting with Dr. Chen. She seems upset. James sighed. My government's not happy either. They think I'm causing a diplomatic incident. Valera stood up, her hover platform activating smoothly. Then we'll face both our peoples together. Show them that sometimes the best answers come from unexpected places. As they left the garden, Valera noticed how naturally they'd started walking in step with each other, despite their different heights. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest changes start with the smallest things. The Imperial Grand Hall fell silent as Lord Daxton, head of the most powerful noble house after the royal family, stepped forward. His 12-foot frame towered over the throne platform as he raised his ceremonial staff. I challenge Princess Valera's right to succession. His voice boomed through the hall. She has shown herself unworthy through her association with lesser beings. Valera stood straight on her hover platform, her face calm despite her racing heart. She had expected this since the processor incident. Beside her, James watched from a special observation platform built for smaller diplomatic guests. Emperor Cathax leaned forward on his throne. You understand, Lord Daxton, that such a challenge requires trial by the ancient ways. I do, Your Majesty. Let the princess prove herself in the 3 trials, if she can. Whispers spread through the crowd. The 3 trials hadn't been used in over 100 years. They were designed to test nobility in mind, body, and spirit. Tests meant for full-sized Imperials. I accept the challenge. Valera's clear voice cut through the whispers. And I claim my right to choose one advisor for the trials. More whispers. Everyone knew who she would pick, and they weren't happy about it. I choose Dr. James Chen of Earth. The hall erupted in outrage. Lord Daxton's face darkened to deep silver in anger. This is an insult to our traditions. The law says I may choose any advisor recognized by the Empire. Valera countered. Earth is recognized. Dr. Chen is qualified. Unless you're afraid of competing against a small princess and her human advisor. That silenced the hall. No noble would admit to such fear. Later, in Valera's garden, James helped her prepare. Tell me about these trials, he said, studying ancient texts on his datapad. The trial of mind is first, solving the puzzle of elements, Valera explained. Then the trial of body, racing through the crystal caverns. Finally, the trial of spirit in the chamber of ancestors. James nodded thoughtfully. They expect you to fail because of your size. But being small means you think differently. You see solutions others miss. They spent the next week preparing. Valera taught James about imperial physics and history, while he shared human problem-solving techniques. They practiced in secret, using her garden and the maintenance tunnels to train. On the day of the first trial, the Grand Hall was packed. The puzzle of elements, a complex holographic maze of chemical reactions, floated in the center. Lord Daxton stepped up first. Watch carefully, Valera whispered to James. See how he thinks. Lord Daxton was good. His large hands moved gracefully through the hologram, solving complex equations. But when he reached the carbon reaction section, similar to the processor problem, he slowed down. Then it was Valera's turn. Instead of trying to match Daxton's traditional approach, She used what she and James had learned from the processor crisis. Her small fingers darted through the hologram, finding patterns others had missed. Impossible. Lord Daxton shouted as Valera completed the puzzle in half his time. She must have cheated. She didn't cheat. James stood up from his observation spot. She just saw what you couldn't. Valera's victory in the first trial sent shockwaves through the Imperial Court. But as she and James prepared for the Crystal Caverns, they knew the hardest challenges were still to come. They'll make the next trial even harder, James warned. Valera smiled, her violet eyes gleaming with determination. Good. Then we'll show them that being different isn't just an advantage, it's the future. The Crystal Caverns glowed with blue light as Valera prepared for the second trial. The ancient maze of crystalline tunnels stretched deep underground, designed to test strength and endurance. Lord Daxton stood confidently at the starting line, his huge frame casting shadows on the crystal walls. Remember, James whispered to Valera, you're not racing his way. You're racing your way. Valera nodded, thinking of their practice runs through the maintenance tunnels. Being small had taught her things about moving through tight spaces that no full-sized Imperial would ever learn. The race began. Lord Daxton charged forward, his long strides eating up the distance, but Valera had studied the cave maps carefully with James. Where Daxton followed the main tunnels, she dove into smaller side passages that her hover platform could navigate easily. The princess is cheating again. Someone shouted from the observation gallery. Those paths weren't meant to be used. No rule says they can't be, James called back. The goal is to reach the end. How you get there is up to you. Valera emerged from the caves first, her silver skin dusty, but her eyes bright with triumph. The crowd's reaction was different this time. Instead of angry shouts, there were murmurs of interest. That evening, something unexpected happened. A young noble named Civil approached Valera in her garden. She was only 8 feet tall, considered short by Imperial standards. Princess, Civil said quietly, there are others like me. Not as small as you, but different. We've been hiding, trying to seem normal. But watching you, she straightened up proudly. You're showing us we don't have to hide anymore. More came forward over the next few days. A court scholar with unusually dark silver skin. A merchant's son who was broader and shorter than the Imperial ideal. Each had a story of feeling wrong, different, less than perfect. James helped Valera document each case, using his anthropologist training from Earth. Your people are evolving, he explained. It's natural. Humans went through similar changes as we spread across our planet. The final trial approached. The test of spirit in the Chamber of Ancestors. But now Valera had an army of supporters, not just the different ones, but others who had begun to question the old ways. Lord Daxton was furious. This is corruption of our pure bloodlines. He thundered in court. The princess and her human pet are destroying everything we stand for. No, Valera replied calmly. We're showing you everything we could be. She turned to address the whole court. Look at what we achieved at the processor. A human's creativity and a small princess's ability to reach tight spaces solved a problem no perfect Imperial could fix. Diversity isn't our weakness, it's our strength. The Chamber of Ancestors was said to test the spirit by showing visions of the Empire's past. As Valera prepared to enter, James gave her hand a quick squeeze. Remember, he said, the past is important, but the future is what we make it. She smiled at him. I think the ancestors are about to see something new. As Valera entered the ancient chamber, she heard voices rising from the court gallery. More people were standing up, sharing their stories of being different. A revolution was beginning, not with weapons or violence, but with the simple courage to be oneself. The final trial would test more than just Valera's spirit. It would test the Empire's readiness to change, to grow, to see that sometimes the greatest strength comes in the smallest packages. The Chamber of Ancestors glowed with ancient light as Valera faced her final trial. The massive doors sealed behind her, leaving her alone with the wisdom and judgment of 1,000 generations. Her hover platform deactivated. This test had to be faced on her own 2 feet. The air shimmered, and ghostly figures appeared around her. Past emperors, great warriors, and legendary leaders, all towering 12 feet tall, looked down at her with glowing eyes. "You have brought change to our eternal empire," a voice echoed through the chamber. "Why should we accept this?" Valera stood straight, looking up without fear. "Because change is already here. Our people are evolving. Fighting it will only make us weaker." The ancestors showed her visions of the empire's past glory. Great ships among the stars, mighty cities that touched the clouds, achievements that had made them the greatest civilization in known space. "All this was built by following our traditions," another voice boomed. "No," Valera replied. "All this was built by daring to do what hadn't been done before. Our ancestors didn't reach the stars by staying safe on the ground." The chamber filled with new visions, the processor crisis, the maintenance tunnels, her races through the crystal caverns. Then images of the others like her. Civil, the young nobles who were different, all those who had hidden their true selves. "And the human?" a gentle voice asked. "What place does he have in our future?" Valera smiled. "He showed me that being different isn't a weakness. His people succeeded not by being the biggest or strongest, but by adapting, by thinking in new ways. That's what our empire needs now." The chamber fell silent. Then, slowly, the ghostly figures began to change. Among the 12-foot ancestors, smaller figures appeared. Past citizens who had been different, who had hidden their gifts out of fear. "Perhaps," the first voice said softly, "it is time for the empire to remember all of its children, not just the ones who fit the ancient mold." Light filled the chamber, warm and accepting. When Valera emerged, the waiting crowd saw her walking tall, without her hover platform, proud of exactly who she was. The emperor stood from his throne. "The ancestors have spoken. They accept the princess's vision of our future." Lord Daxton tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out by cheers, not just from Valera's supporters, but from many who had finally seen the truth. 1 month later, Valera stood in the Great Hall again. This time, James stood beside her as she addressed the empire through broadcast channels that reached every colony and settlement. "Today, we change the laws of succession," she announced. "No longer will we judge worth by height or size or any single measure. The empire's strength lies in its diversity, in all the different ways we can solve problems and face challenges." She looked at James, then back to the cameras. "And today, we also announce a new partnership. Earth and the empire will work together, learning from each other's strengths, starting with a joint institute for innovation, where people of all sizes and backgrounds can contribute their ideas." The celebration lasted for days. In Valera's garden, now expanded into the first campus of the new institute, she and James watched the twin moons rise. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, I was just hoping to find someone who wouldn't reject me for my size." James took her hand. "And instead, you found someone who helped you change an empire." Valera smiled. "No, we changed it together, by being exactly who we are." Above them, the stars shone bright with promise. The empire was entering a new era, one where being different wasn't a flaw to hide, but a gift to celebrate. And it had all started because a tiny princess and a human engineer had dared to look at problems, and each other, in a completely new way.